Hey guys, this is Steve from Brown Mix and Master, and today we're going through what is compression and how does it work. I'm hoping that I can keep this straightforward and simple enough for a beginner or an artist to understand who might not even use a tool like this, and be comprehensive enough for someone who would use this on a daily basis to really get a firm understanding of what compression does and how it works. So let's get after it. Simply put, compression is a tool used by audio engineers and producers all the time to simply make any audio source that you run through it seem more consistent and even so you can hear all the details in the take. This is achieved by reducing the loudest parts of the signal, and a side effect of that is that it's more consistent because the top parts and the low parts are actually more similar in volume. So if you're listening to a raw vocal and you're just thinking, it's missing something, I don't know what it is about it, it's lacking energy, it just isn't consistent from word to word, you might actually be thinking you need to use more compression. Let's get into the nitty-gritty and I'll show you what I mean. All right, real quick, before we get into what the compression does and what all the controls do, I just want to show you an A/B of what the difference is without compression and with compression. Now, I recorded this probably with a little bit, but keep in mind, you'll still hear the difference. All right, so here is without the compression. Let's just check that out first.
Blood in my hands turns into glitter, and honest, it don't feel any different. Shining, the more pain, the better. Love goes when you don't ease the tension.
All right, and here's what it sounds like with some aggressive compression on it.
Blood in my hands turns into glitter, and honest, it don't feel any different. Shining, the more pain, the better. Love goes when you don't ease the tension.
All right, so now real quick, I'll give you a back and forth. So I'm gonna have it off and then on and then off and then on.
Blood in my hands turns into glitter, and honest, it don't feel any different. Shining, the more pain, the better. Love goes when you don't ease the tension. I can always spot the decoys, the quiet ones crave the most noise, yeah. And I can see you in the back, I know you want attention, but let's focus on the lesson. These things don't last in my mind. I never wanted to hurt you, but what you think is yours, I know is mine. So I plan out the attack and watch it all stack. Now soon you're gonna find out. Dirt in my...
What did you hear between the two? I noticed that the vocals come way up front and they're so much more in your face with the compression. Leave in the comments what you think you hear. All right, so let's go through the different controls on a compressor. I picked this Avid Pro compressor that comes in the Avid bundle that you can get with a Pro Tools subscription because it's pretty normal and it has a lot of very common parameter controls on it that you would see in a lot of different modern compressors. So let's get into it. All right, before we touch any knobs, I think we should talk about the meter on a compressor. This is really what shows us what's happening visually. Obviously, we want to be thinking first with our ears, but it's helpful to know when it's kicking in and when it's not. So let me play the track again, and you can see that the meter is showing how much gain is being reduced. That's over here.
Blood in my hands turns into glitter, and honest, it don't feel any different. Shining, the more pain, the better.
So as you can see, there's about 3 to 6 decibels of gain reduction being applied to the track right now. But let's go through all the individual parameters. So the threshold control controls when the compression is actually going to kick in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to crank the threshold all the way up so it's not doing anything, and then show you what happens when we bring it in.
Blood in my hands turns into glitter, and honest, it don't feel any different. Shining, the more pain, the better. Love goes when you don't ease the tension.
Notice how the meter was moving when I would pull the threshold down. This really controls at what point the compression. This really controls at what point the compression is going to start doing something because every signal comes in at a different level and will have different jumps in volume. All right, next we have ratio. Now, the Pro compressor also is helpful to visualize this because it has a visual here of this curve of what's happening with the compression. As I change the ratio, notice how the curve becomes more and more steep. So what's going to happen is the louder the signal gets, the further it's going to cut it. Whereas so if you have a nice soft slope like this, it's only going to cut it so much. But if you get really aggressive, it's going to cut it a lot. So let me show you the two differences here. I'll show you first a light ratio, and then I'll just crank it.
Blood in my hands turns into glitter, and honest, it don't feel any different. Shining, the more pain, the better. always spot the decoys. The quiet ones crave the most noise, yeah. And
so notice as I got it really far down there, it was almost gone. It'll really just go nuts the further you go. All right, next we have knee. This really comes up more on auto digital compressors that are more modern. Still worth talking about. This really controls how the slope is right here at the threshold. So you notice if I crank it up, it gets smooth, but then I can make it a nice aggressive cut there. What this means is it'll more or less leave the signal intact until it hits the threshold. But if you soften the knee, it starts to reduce it a little bit earlier. Next, we have the attack knob, and what this really does is it actually affects how quickly the compression will kick in. And might as well talk about it while we're here. Release will control how quickly the compression will stop. So let's play with those real quick.
blood in my hands turns into glitter. And honest, it don't feel any different. Shining, the more pain the better. Love kills when you don't ease the tension. I can always spot the decoys. The quiet ones crave the most noise, yeah. And I can see you in the back. I know you want attention, but let's focus on the lesson.
So what's really happening here is when the attack is really fast, it's actually preventing any peaks at the beginning of the transient, whereas if you slow it down, it actually lets some of those peaks through at the beginning. Oftentimes I like to go a little bit slower on drums so the beginning has a nice punch to it. Now with the release, the same thing is really happening. It's just at the tail end of the audio. It actually will determine how quickly the compression will stop or if it will stay engaged for a long period of time. This depth knob on the Pro Compressor isn't super common, but I'll go through and talk about what it does anyway because it's a cool feature. This depth knob actually controls how far it'll let the signal be compressed. So say I set it to -5, it'll only compress at a maximum of 5 and then stop compressing at that point. Pretty cool. Next, we have makeup gain. This can be super important because what's happening when we're compressing, we're actually taking away signal from the top, and it's actually going to lower the volume. So typically, you do have to add a little bit of makeup gain, so that way you're not losing volume on what you're trying to compress. Here, I'll show you an example without any makeup gain and with makeup gain. And this really comes into effect when you bypass the plugin in and out.
Blood in my hands turns into glitter. And honest, it don't feel any different. Shining, the more pain the better. Love kills when you don't ease the tension. I can always spot the decoys.
Now without any makeup gain added.
Blood in my hands turns into glitter. And honest, it don't feel any different. Shining, the more pain the better. Love kills when you don't ease the tension. I can always spot the decoys. The quiet ones crave the most noise, yeah. And I can see you in the back. I know you want attention, but let's focus on the lesson.
This is really just an attempt to make sure that you're not losing level when you're compressing. So you can just boost it back up a little bit at the end when you're done. And last but not least, there's a dry mix knob on this compressor, which can be super common for a modern plug-in compressor. This actually controls how much of the compressed signal goes into the mix. So right now, when it's fully wet, you're actually hearing a 100% compressed signal, but you can actually blend to lower percentages and you won't hear as much compressed signal. This is actually blending the original dry signal with the wet compressed mix. So let's check that out.
Blood in my hands turns into glitter. And honest, it don't feel any different. Shining, the more pain the better. Love kills when you don't ease the tension. I can always spot the decoys. The quiet ones crave the most noise, yeah. And I can see you in the back. I know you want attention, but let's focus on the lesson. These things don't last in my mind. I never wanted to hurt you, but what you think is yours, I know is mine. So
There you have it. There's the controls on most digital compressors. Before we go, I do think it's important to go through how some of these vintage old school analog style plug-in compressors work. This is actually the one I used in the mix for this song. Essentially, the main difference is that there's no threshold knob on a lot of these more old school plugins, and the compression threshold actually gets set by how much signal is going into the compressor. So let's check it out. I'll show you what I mean.
blood in my hands turns into glitter. And honest, it don't feel any different. Shining, the more pain the better. Love kills when you don't ease the tension. I can always spot the decoys. The quiet ones crave the most noise, yeah. And I can see you in the back. I know you want attention, but let's focus
The easiest way to think about this is that the compressor has a set threshold, and you can drive the unit in with more signal or less signal, and it will either compress more or less. Then you use your output gain as a makeup gain knob. I hope this helps. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned about compression, what it is, how it works, what it does, and when you should use it in your projects. Keep making awesome music, and I'll see you soon.